Writing, the second wrong book, by Thomas Caulfield, a sort of biography of writing the Velvet Paw of Asquith novels. Chapter 1. Homecoming. Thomas stood on a doormat and wondered whether he ought to apologise to it. Although doormats were used to being stood upon, he was convinced they were far less accustomed to being apologised to, which was unfair considering the extent they were stood upon. Moreover, Thomas wasn't convinced he ranked any higher in the overall scheme of things than it did. Before he had a chance to, however, the door opened and Thomas shat himself. The massive woman standing before him glared with the sort of disgust and contempt that unreasonable mothers are renowned for. "Hello, Mother," said Thomas, not wanting to move because of the considerable volume of excrement filling his trousers. Her contempt bred a sneer so robust that it could have been used to move crates around large industrial warehouses. She turned from him inasmuch as her massive frame allowed when confined by walls, and shook her head as much as an absence of neck permitted.
"Shit yourself, did you?"
she said. "Not really. It's just remnants of last night's dinner." She scoffed.
"Cooked, did you?"
"In a manner of speaking. I fried some beans."
"Did you remember to take them out of the tin first?"
"Well, that's where the manner of speaking comes in." He left the doormat and followed her, apologising to it after all, considering the manure that had run down his trouser leg and dribbled over his shoe.
"You didn't just shit on my doormat, did you?"
She was already elsewhere, though her contempt was omniscient. "In a manner of speaking," said Thomas. The house was small, drab, and devoid of colour, other than faded hues of once fashionable pastels and the bright labels of empty soft drink containers. There were also some pictures of diseased mouths that cigarette packets specialise in, which had been nailed to the walls in an attempt at themed decor, and a stale fog hung in the air that smelt as though it still held bits of lung. He followed her into a kitchen only marginally less pleasant than the inside of his trousers.
"Can't hack living by yourself, then,"
she said, wedging against a grimy plastic table piled with ashtrays so stuffed that the whole arrangement looked geothermal. She fell onto a chair that wouldn't remain functional much longer and scowled. "I can hack it, Mother," Thomas said. "I've just returned for Oscar, that's all." She scoffed again, or coughed. It was hard to discern through the stink of smoke.
"I don't know where your stupid cat is."
She indicated a sink piled with broken dishes.
"It's probably under that lot."
She lit a cigarette and continued killing herself. "Is he outside?" Thomas asked, keen for some fresh air.
"How should I know? I haven't been out there myself since the late 70s.
Thomas opened a back door that looked onto a small area paved in rubbish, some of which popped up a fence that was in no state to define boundaries. He looked fondly at the remnants of a tree which he used to swing from as a child, up until his mother had it poisoned and burnt. He called his cat, but there was no sound other than the muffled pop of dead rats caught beneath layers of discarded asbestos and fossilised stratification of newspapers. Despite the grey and mould, the sky above was blue, and he smiled at having the courage to finally leave home. He returned indoors, uncertain whether he should check his room, despite having grown up in it. His mother hadn't been happy about him leaving, despite consistently telling him to fuck off. "Should I check in my room?" he called, worried what she might have done to it, considering the screams and punches she'd thrown the last time he was in it.
"It's no longer your room."
"But have you turned it into a study then?" he asked.
"What do I need a study for? I'm not some stupid wanker."
"Well, it's nice to have a study."
"That's because you're a stupid wanker."
Thomas sighed. "We've been over this, Mother." He looked at its door and the remnants of sticky tape that had once held up pictures he'd done on the rare occasions he'd gone to school, until she'd burnt them also. "I'm not a stupid wanker," he said. "I just find being here rather suffocating, that's all."
"An ungrateful, stupid wanker."
"Mother, I'm 36. I can't stay home forever. We've been over this."
"Tosser."
"I'm not a tosser."
"Fucking ungrateful, stupid, wanky tosser."
"Mother, please. This isn't helping anyone." He put a hand upon what was left of the door's handle. "And anyway, You've been telling me to leave for ages.
It's because you're such a fucking stupid wanking tosser.
I'm not a tosser, Mother. You know that. You're just trying to get me upset.
Fuckwit.
I'm not going to rise to it, Mother. Moving out has been a good thing. It's made me see things differently.
Oh, you retard, she said. You sound like such a fucking retarded, stupid, ranking tosser. No wonder you can't get a girlfriend. Any woman who'd accidentally look at you would wonder whether you even have a penis.
Mother!
Despite the fact that you look like a dick.
I do not look like a dick.
You do. You look like a small dick that doesn't work.
You know, said Thomas, opening the door, it's only since moving out that I've realised how unhelpful that sort of talk is. He didn't get any further, and instead threw a hand over his mouth and stared at a room he didn't recognise. Its walls, once a cadaver shade of grey, were completely wallpapered in thick wads of clotted newspaper, as was his bed and the ceiling, the latter covered in brown lumps of papier-mâché that looked like massive infestations of wasp nests. The air was damp with ink and rotting paper, some of which had liquefied and run in dark oil across what had once been a carpet, but now looked even more geothermal than the kitchen table. Sick squirted between his fingers, and he collapsed to the floor, where he breathed heavily until an asthma attack prevented both. When he looked up, his mother's excuse for ankles were in front of him. He looked up further at a towering mass of postmenopausal woman that rendered assignment of gender redundant.
Look at you,
she sneered, hands on the sort of hips that afforded her the same displacement as an ocean-going steamliner.
Pathetic. Do you really think you can survive out there without getting punched or hospitalised?
What would you know? He said, spitting at Sick and wiping his hands across carpet. You haven't been out in it for decades.
It's because I was too busy bringing you up.
Thomas pulled himself up the wall. A week ago, he'd never have dared challenge her, but since moving out, he'd found an unfamiliar confidence. And after the sort of childhood that social services were invented for, he saw her in a different light, and one that had him realising darkness existed for a reason. Bringing me up, he cried. But you didn't give me a name until I was 9.
That's because you didn't deserve one.
But every child deserves a name.
Not if they don't matter.
Well, that's not what social services said.
Social services can go and fuck themselves, and then they can fuck you. They'd like that, considering you're such a dick.
You can't keep saying that, Mother.
Dick.
Mother, please.
Dick.
When he put hands over his ears, she shouted,
Dick.
I'm not a dick.
What are you then?
No, Mother, no more. Her bulk loomed closer in a mass of dead ash and loathing.
What are you?
He felt sobs rise. I'm not doing this anymore. I can't. He tried pulling his head off, despite a lifetime of previous attempts being unsuccessful. A slap stung his arms.
What are you?
She growled.
Tell me.
I'm not doing it, Mother, he cried, wanting to cradle himself and sink to the floor. Not anymore.
You tell me what you are,
she cried,
or you will go to your room. Now, what are you?
Through gritted teeth he growled, I'm not doing this anymore.
Right, we'll see about that.
She grabbed his hair and dragged him towards the newspaper-clad room. No, he cried, flailing at her. Not in there. She pulled his head backwards and leant close.
And tell me what you are.
Sobs arrived. He would have collapsed, but his scalp wouldn't let him.
Tell me.
A failure.
Louder.
A failure.
And what else?
He tried shaking his head, but her grip refused. She pushed him closer. No.
Then what else are you?
A dick.
And?
A retard. Sobs grew with each confession. And a stupid fucking wanker. She dropped him like an aborted fetus before pulling a sleeve up his arm and pointing at the scars upon it.
I've already made it clear once before, haven't I?
She said. He tried nodding, but continued shaking instead.
Read it.
I can't see properly. When she slapped his face, tears flew all over the place.
Read it.
Failure, he whispered. She nodded.
And don't you ever forget it.
After a solid kick, she doused him in the sort of phlegm he'd already coughed up all over the carpet. He lay for a time, wondering whether returning for his cat had been a mistake. Chapter 2. Poles and Beans. The rain was oddly German, which Thomas put down to it being grey and well engineered. He stood in it and waited for a bus. Others were waiting also, but in a shelter nearby. They looked at him strangely to begin with, considering there was plenty of room under cover, but ignored him after realising he was peculiar. He ignored them also, and continued getting wet, uncertain whether he wanted their sympathy or to be left alone. He decided it was the latter, considering he wouldn't know what to do with sympathy unless it was accompanied with an instruction manual. London was grey and wet, and glistened like a jewel that everyone knew about but had largely forgotten. Despite the rain, it needed cleaning, and Thomas stared at stone and street and wondered how much effort would be required to take it all apart and rebuild the place in a way that would make him relevant. He didn't want much in life, other than to be more than nothing, which, according to his arm, was unlikely to occur. "Oi, are you getting on?" All he wanted was his cat, being the one thing in his life that hadn't tried setting fire to him. Only since leaving home was he able to see things this clearly. It had taken a week to see a lifetime. In one way, he'd have preferred remaining blind. "Oi, matey!" a man cried. "Are you wanting to get on or not?" He turned to see a bus had arrived, and the last to get on was calling him. "Are you wanting to get on this thing or stand there and dissolve slowly?" "Oh, yes, right," said Thomas, hurrying to it. "Sorry, I was thinking about something else." "You've been standing in the rain for 15 minutes, mate," the man said, unimpressed. "I doubt you've been thinking at all." "I was, actually," said Thomas, scrabbling through sodden clothes for his bus pass. "I've been thinking a lot lately, sometimes all day. It was quite tiring." The man said nothing and wandered down the aisle. Thomas waved his bus pass at the driver, and the vehicle moved off. Passengers retreated as he wandered past, as he'd inadvertently brought rain indoors. An elderly woman muttered something along these lines, while another tutted after he turned to apologise and doused her with some. "Sorry," he said, dousing a third. "I got a bit wet, I'm afraid." There were several seats free, and the man who'd got on before him scowled from a window in a manner suggesting he didn't want to be disturbed, particularly by a soaking wet wanker. Thomas suspected there were some young women nearby, but didn't dare look on account of being a soaking wet wanker. When he sat, his trousers made socially unacceptable noises. "That wasn't me," he said to everyone in his vicinity. "I mean, it was me a bit, but more my trousers, rather than anything contained within them." When no one responded, he wondered about saying it louder before deciding on elaboration instead. "They're wet, you see," he said. "I mean, they're wet because of the rain rather than anything I've done directly to them." He pointed outside, which had got greyer and streakier. "It's raining, and some of it got on my trousers." He turned to the man. "You were there. Could you tell them?" "What?" It was said with a sneer. "Could you confirm that I've been out in the rain and my trousers have got squeaky?" "No one cares, mate." He looked from his window again. Thomas glanced at a passenger who he suspected was a young woman to discover she was. She had headphones on and was, therefore, unlikely to have heard his trousers. Across the aisle, another young woman had turned from him to face her window, which only aggravated his concerns. He turned to the man again. "Could you just tell her?" "What is your problem?" It was said as though if there wasn't one, there would be shortly. "It's just that I think she heard." "Heard what?" "The sound from my trousers." The man stared with the sort of contempt that ran Parliament. "She doesn't give a fuck, mate." It was quite loud. "No one gives a fuck." Thomas glanced at her again, certain she was pretty, though couldn't see her face. "But I can't say it again." he said. "I've already mentioned it twice." The man leant forwards. "She couldn't give a fuck if you had shit tattooed on your ass, mate. Please." The man was chewing gum. His arms were folded, and he considered Thomas for a time before leaning across the aisle. "Hey, sweetheart, this wanker wants you to know that he's just filled his pants with shit." She shifted to face the window completely. "No," hissed Thomas. "That's not what I meant." "Oh? Well, sorry, mate. I just assumed that's what the noise was." "No, I said it wasn't from my bottom. I said it was from my wet trousers. Wasn't that the same thing?" Horrified, Thomas turned from him and shrank into his seat. Having never dealt with women before, he was certain that wet noises from his trousers would do little to help him start, and a public announcement that he'd shat himself would help even less. He was a man, supposedly, who'd moved out of home, and decided, therefore, that a further public broadcast, of which he was in charge, was required to clarify the situation. He stood. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the bus's entire contents, "but I feel it necessary to clarify that I have not filled my pants with excrement. The sound you may or may not have heard when I sat down was a result of my trouser fabric having become wet from the rain outside and not from any inadvertent defecation on my part." Most passengers had turned to listen, and even the driver glanced in his mirror. Encouraged, Thomas decided to straighten other things out also. He pointed at the man in the seat behind. "Even though this gentleman was good enough to inform me that the bus had arrived while I was busy thinking about my cat, he nevertheless failed to comply with the request to provide verbal evidence of my wet trousers." The man laughed. "Having nothing to do with bodily functions and everything to do with local meteorological conditions." There was silence. "Right. Well, so long as that's all clear. This man is unhelpful, and I did not just fill my pants with shit." When sitting, his trousers uttered another socially unacceptable noise that had him cringe and the man behind collapse in hysterics. Thomas spent the rest of the journey with his forehead against the window, wondering whether the vibrations would damage his brain. He dared not look at anyone, and ignored the chuckle and shoulder pat the man gave when disembarking. Thomas's stop was toward the end of the route, where the streets were so ordinary that flat rentals only remained affordable until food was required by those renting them. The bus was empty by the time he alighted, and the driver indifferent to his assurances that he hadn't ruined its upholstery. It rumbled away in a whine of diesel and wet street, leaving Thomas alone on a pavement. When he'd moved out of home a week ago, he'd felt the sort of liberation more traditionally experienced in successful bail applications. This had waned shortly afterwards, however, when he'd rented a small, damp flat and tried cooking some beans. His inexperience with everything resulted in him almost burning the place down, though the flat's dampness prevented anything serious from eventuating. Nevertheless, after discovering that tins don't melt as part of the overall cooking process, but do explode and take out large chunks of ceiling, Thomas realised he didn't like being on his own and decided to return for his cat. His landlady had been adamant that no pets were allowed until Thomas pointed out that rats were in residence long before he was, and that he'd already named several. She agreed to let him have his cat, provided it killed at least one rat a day, which he was to leave in a plastic bag outside her door as evidence. Thomas had asked if this could be in lieu of rent, to which she laughed so hard that she'd had a coronary. This left the entire arrangement in the hands of a stepdaughter, 3 cousins, and an assortment of lawyers, all of whom permitted him to remain at the set rate, provided the rat arrangement held, although none required evidence in a bag. The rain had begun again, though as drizzle, which didn't help his confidence, as it implied that even falling down was an effort when he was around. He walked up some steps so worn and broken that they'd been reclassified as a disability ramp, and pushed at a door reclassified similarly. There was no need for keys, he'd been told, because the last time the flats had been burgled, items had been left out of pity rather than taken, including a crowbar that was now used to prop up the stairwell. He climbed its stairs, taking care not to step on them, and reached a landing that sagged to such an extent that the need for stairs was debatable. After opening a door that he'd made out of breakfast cereal boxes and used band-aids, he stood in his flat and sighed as deeply as he dared, considering it smelt like a crime scene. Having anticipated returning with Oscar, his failure to do so made the world more dreary still. It would be some time before he dared return to his mother's, which left him concerned for his cat's well-being. He went to a stove and tried heating some beans, which either took out a window or made one. Discovering that heating beans for long enough invariably takes out infrastructure left Thomas realising something profound. He might not be a failure after all. Had he failed at heating beans and starved, he'd no longer be around to continue puncturing walls with exploding tins. Moreover, the more holes he made, the more the place had aired, which left it smelling like seaweed, rather than something requiring a chalk outline and numbered photographs. He ate, went to bed, vomited, and slept. The next morning, he awoke to so much sunlight streaming into the place that the walls looked yellow rather than the greyness of lichen he'd occasionally scraped off in an effort at renovation and as a supplement to beans. He lay on a mattress and stared at the colour under the conviction he was suffering jaundice. It was only when his urine began getting cold that he rolled off the thing to have a closer look. The walls were distinctly yellow, as though having been painted intentionally. He touched its flakes. They were warm from sun. He pressed against them, having never seen warm, coloured walls before, as the haze at his mother's meant colour didn't exist, and the only warmth he'd experienced were from cigarette burns. Closing his eyes, he was amazed at having survived 36 years, and decided that from now on, things were going to be different. He'd be an independent man, rather than failed son. He'd become something, rather than be nothing. He scratched a boil, and wondered whether a tetanus shot might be a good start. He went to a hole in the wall and looked upon a world that could be his, if only he had talent and charisma, looks and intelligence. If he had Oscar, he could probably be classified as a family. Retrieving his cat would be further proof that he wasn't a failure, considering he'd fed the thing for years without it dying once. He scraped some beans off the hole's edge. They'd been warmed by the sun, which had him finding courage, along with salmonella. Before him, the street lay in a mass of graffiti, uncollected refuse and burning tyres. For the first time in his life, he threw his arms wide and laughed, feeling to own the world, which was disconcerting, considering how small his flat was. He stopped laughing and turned back to it, wondering where he'd put it all.